What would you do if the very guardians sworn to protect the sacred turned their power against their own, unleashing punishment so brutal that even the elders of an ancient cult trembled in silence? Imagine standing inside the shadowed halls of the Temple of Baal, where torches burned not for light, but for judgment, and where every whispered oath carried the weight of fear. You think you know ancient civilizations. You think you have heard every dark secret buried beneath clay tablets and ruined altars. But what happened to the so-called sacred traitors was never meant to be known. It was concealed behind stone doors, erased from official tablets, and whispered only in the nightmares of those who survived long enough to remember. This story is not simply about rituals. It is about a system designed to crush betrayal with a level of cruelty that defied even the laws of the God they served. As you step with me into this forgotten world, the air thick with incense and dread, ask yourself why a priesthood revered for its mystical knowledge needed punishment chambers hidden beneath the main altar. Why did the guardians of Baal forge implements that no ceremonial ritual required? Why were chants recorded in fragmented scripts that scholars describe as warnings rather than prayers? The truth is that ancient religions carried darkness not because they were primitive, but because power, once unchallenged, grows bold enough to warp devotion into terror. These guardians believed they were maintaining divine order, but what they created was a labyrinth of fear where loyalty meant survival and doubt meant disappearance. And here is the part that unsettles historians. The elders of the temple who designed the earliest doctrines did not anticipate what their successors would become. The guardians transformed sacred laws into weapons, rituals into sentences, faith into control. They turned the temple into a machine, a place where traitors were judged not by guilt, but by usefulness. Every shadow held a secret. Every prayer hid a threat. And every punishment served as a reminder that no one escaped the eyes of Baal. You may think these stories are exaggerations, but archaeological evidence and scattered cuneiform fragments hint at practices so severe that modern scholars still debate whether they were acts of devotion or calculated psychological torture. And what you are about to hear may challenge every assumption you have about ancient religion, sacred, duty, and the devastating consequences of disobedience. What if the ones chosen to preserve the will of the gods were the same ones who twisted it into something unrecognizable? Before we descend into the chambers where fate was decided in screams and silence, tell me something. Have you ever felt that history hides the darkest truths behind the thinnest veil? If this opening shook something inside you, leave a comment sharing what part struck you first. Hit the like button to help this story reach more curious minds, and check if you are already subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. What you will discover as we continue might surprise you, and the path ahead grows even darker as we step deeper into the forbidden corridors of the temple. The origins of the clergy who served within the Temple of Baal were far older and far more complex than most modern interpretations suggest. Long before the punishments, long before the hidden corridors, and the rituals that would later terrify even their own elders, these priests were shaped by a lineage forged in blood, famine, and fear. The earliest guardians were not selected for wisdom or piety. They were chosen for their endurance, their capacity to obey without hesitation, and, above all, their willingness to sacrifice everything for the stability of the temple. In a world where kingdoms rose and fell with seasonal storms, a priesthood that could not be bent had to be hardened from the inside. As generations passed, what began as a circle of spiritual interpreters transformed into a tightly controlled hierarchy, ruled by vows so absolute that breaking them was considered a threat to cosmic balance. These vows were not spoken lightly. They were sealed in darkness, in chambers illuminated only by oil lamps carved with the symbol of Baal's unblinking eye. Each initiate underwent a process that modern historians struggle to categorize. It was neither a rite of passage nor simple training. It was indoctrination, designed to sever a novice from their former identity. The world beyond the temple walls was dismissed as fragile, corrupt, and unworthy. Only the temple was eternal. Only the temple mattered. The elders crafted these doctrines with the belief that unwavering loyalty would preserve their sacred order. But loyalty enforced by fear becomes something else entirely. The earliest writings describe the guardians as protectors of divine law, men and women who mediated storms, harvests, and the unseen, forces believed to shape the fate of nations. Yet, as power accumulated, the guardians shifted from interpreters to enforcers, and eventually from enforcers to judges whose authority required no validation beyond their collective word. Those who faltered or hesitated during rituals were not corrected. They were watched. Those who questioned a command were marked. Doubt was not a sin. It was a threat, and every threat required containment. Over time, new layers of secrecy were added, each more restrictive than the last. Initiates swore not only to protect the temple's sacred texts, but also to conceal the darker chapters that had begun to grow around them. Some tablets hinted at disputes within the clergy, conflicts that were resolved not through debate, but through rituals that demanded unquestioned obedience. Others referenced initiates who disappeared following their vows, erased so thoroughly that even their names vanished from genealogies. These losses were attributed to divine will, but whispers among the novices suggested otherwise. From these fractures emerged the concept of the sacred traitor, a category so ambiguous that it could be applied to anyone who wavered, hesitated, or simply understood too much. The Guardians used this term to justify actions that no doctrine ever officially sanctioned. Through this evolving structure, the temple produced a generation of priests who believed that their power was not granted by the gods, but demanded by the gods. Punishment became a ritual. Fear became a tool. And the origin of the clergy, once rooted in protection and guidance, slowly hardened into a legacy of hidden authority. What makes this transformation even more unsettling is how natural it seemed to those who lived within it. The elders believed they were refining the order. The guardians believed they were safeguarding truth. And yet, every vow that tightened, every chamber sealed, every disappearance quietly accepted, prepared the ground for the secret punishments that would one day become the temple's darkest inheritance. The roots of cruelty were already there, waiting for the right moment to emerge as part of the sacred machinery that no one dared question. The guardians of the Temple of Baal did not simply wait for betrayal to reveal itself. They cultivated an atmosphere in which suspicion thrived, where every gesture, every pause in a chant, every misplaced word became potential evidence of disloyalty. Identifying as sacred. Traitor was less about discovering an act of wrongdoing and more about interpreting subtle cracks in devotion. The guardians understood that fear did more than protect doctrine. It shaped it. And through that shaping came a system in which perceived weakness could be treated as heresy long before it ever manifested in action. Across the temple's inner archives, fragments of cuneiform tablets describe a ritual known only as the silent observance. During this ritual, initiates were brought into a chamber beneath the altar and instructed to meditate in complete darkness. High-ranking guardians watched them from hidden alcoves, not to evaluate their spirituality, but to confirm how long each could endure the suffocating quiet. Some would fidget, others would tremble. A few whispered prayers to calm themselves. Those small human reactions were enough to place a mark beside their names, a mark that never disappeared, no matter how flawlessly they behaved in the days that followed. The silent observance, scholars now believe, was less a test of devotion and more a method of cataloging potential traitors. But there were deeper corridors, more secretive practices. Within the temple existed a group known as the listeners, guardians trained not in ritual, but in perception. Their task was simple. They moved among the priests unnoticed, recording every shift of tone, every deviation from prescribed chants, every hesitation when reciting forbidden passages. To the outside world, they appeared as ordinary servants or low-ranking acolytes, but their true power was far greater. A word from a listener could condemn an initiate to interrogation, exile, or something far worse, because when the listeners spoke, the elders listened, and yet the process did not end with observation. Once a suspected traitor was identified, they were summoned to the Hall of Echoes, a chamber with walls engineered to distort sound, amplifying even the faintest breath. Here, guardians questioned, the accused not by shouting demands, but by whispering doubts. The accused would hear their interrogators and their own voice reverberating back at them, twisting certainty into confusion. Some confessed simply to escape the overwhelming sense that the walls themselves were accusing them. Others remained silent and were deemed even more dangerous. Silence, after all, could be interpreted as defiance. Those judged as sacred traitors did not always understand the precise nature of their crime. Some believed they had misspoken in ritual. Others feared they had been overheard expressing fatigue or fear, but the guardians rarely offered explanations. Their authority depended on ambiguity. So long as the definition of betrayal remained fluid, they could mold it to serve the temple's shifting needs. And by doing so, they ensured that loyalty was never assumed. It had to be demonstrated relentlessly, day after day, ritual after ritual. As centuries passed, these practices became embedded in the structure of the temple. The process of identifying traitors evolved into a kind of sacred science, one based on signs, omens, subtle gestures, and hidden meanings. Traitors were not found. They were interpreted, and those interpretations often revealed more about the guardian's hunger for control than any real act of disobedience. The corridors where these judgments were made grew darker, both literally and symbolically, as if absorbing the weight of every life condemned within them. This is the world the sacred traitors lived in, a world where innocence meant nothing, where devotion could be dissected and weaponized, and where the guardians of Baal refined their methods with every passing generation. And as their power grew, so did the shadow cast by the rituals that awaited those who were unfortunate enough to fall beneath their scrutiny. The rituals reserved for sacred traitors were never written in the official tablets. They existed only in whispers, in fragments carried through generations by acolytes who had seen too much and lived long enough to regret it. These punishments were not part of Baal's doctrine, nor were they sanctioned by the earliest elders. They were inventions of the guardians themselves, crafted in the hidden chambers that only a select few were allowed to enter. These chambers lay beneath the temple's oldest foundations, carved into the bedrock, sealed with inscriptions meant not to ward off evil, but to warn the living. Even now, archaeologists find markings that do not match any known ceremonial script, symbols that seem designed to instill dread rather than offer guidance. Inside these rooms, the walls were coated with a mixture of ash, oil, and crushed minerals, creating surfaces that reflected torchlight in strange, uneven patterns. Some ancient accounts describe shadows moving as though alive, though scholars often attribute this illusion to the flickering light. Still, the guardians used these chambers deliberately, believing that disorientation weakened a traitor's resolve before punishment ever began. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the remnants of incense burned in rituals meant to strip the accused of their spiritual identity. Once a priest crossed that threshold, they were no longer seen as a servant of Baal. In the eyes of the guardians, they became something less than human. The methods employed inside these chambers were designed not to kill, but to break the spirit. One such practice, hinted at in a damaged Assyrian commentary, involved the ritual of the veiled flame. The traitor was bound before a small fire carried in a ceremonial basin. Guardians stood behind screens, chanting in tones meant to confuse the senses. The flame was manipulated using powders that caused it to flare unpredictably, creating bursts of heat that struck like sudden warnings. The goal was not physical harm. It was psychological collapse. A priest, who could no longer distinguish fear from obedience, was considered purified, though the process often left them incapable of returning to normal temple life. Another method, rarely mentioned but unmistakable in the archaeological record, involved an object known as the Stone of Echoes. This heavy slab was engraved with hollow channels that produced unsettling vibrations when struck. The accused would kneel with their head pressed against the stone while guardians recited accusations. The stone amplified their voices into a distorted chorus that overwhelmed the mind. Some traitors confessed to crimes they had never imagined simply to escape the disorienting resonance. Others lost their ability to speak for days, their voices swallowed by the stone's relentless hum. The darkest ritual of all, however, was reserved for those deemed irredeemable. These individuals were taken to a chamber so well hidden that only a handful of guardians knew its location. In this room, the walls were carved with deep grooves, as though scraped, repeatedly, over centuries. It is said that no chants were spoken there. No fires were lit. Only silence accompanied the punishment. A silence so complete that the accused could hear their own heartbeat trembling in their chest. What occurred within that chamber remains largely a mystery, but historians agree on one point. No one who entered it was ever seen in the temple again. What makes these rituals so haunting is not their brutality, but the intent behind them. The guardians believed they were acting in defense of sacred order, that Baal's will demanded they purge weakness wherever they found it. Yet in their pursuit of purity, they created punishments so extreme that even the elders who first approved the guardianship could no longer recognize the institution they had built. Rumor has it that a few elders attempted to intervene, but by then the guardians' power had become unchallengeable. The rituals continued, refined, perfected, and hidden deeper within the temple's heart. If something in this description resonates with you or raises questions, feel free to leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your perspective might reveal angles of this ancient darkness that we have yet to explore, and the discussion can help illuminate the shadows these guardians left behind. The night that changed the temple forever was not marked in any formal record, yet its echoes reached every corner of the clergy in whispered fear. The guardians, who had long enforced loyalty through observation and ritualized intimidation, reached a point where the ordinary punishments were insufficient. Something had shifted in the hierarchy, a decision made in secret chambers by those whose authority had become absolute. On that night, the guardians chose to act not just as judges, but as arbiters of fate itself, taking control of sacred law and bending it to the will of their own calculation. The temple, once a place of devotion, had transformed into a labyrinth of terror, and the traitors now became instruments of its darkest design. Within the inner sanctum, the accused were assembled under the pretense of ceremonial evaluation. Each priest's posture, each hesitated breath, and even the timbre of their voice was scrutinized. The guardian's eyes, trained over decades of ritualized observation, could detect deception, weakness, and doubt with unerring precision. The traitors were not informed of the charges in conventional terms. Words were minimal, gestures were exaggerated, and the environment itself became a tool of psychological warfare. The architecture of the chamber was intentional: low ceilings to induce claustrophobia, polished stone floors that reflected every movement, and corridors that funneled sound in unnatural directions, creating a constant sense that the room itself was watching and judging. This night also marked the introduction of a new form of ritual, one that combined observation with immediate enactment of punishment. When a perceived flaw or hesitation occurred, it triggered an escalation. A guard would appear, a subtle implement would be presented, and the accused would experience a precise, calculated response. These were not improvisations. Each act had been rehearsed, measured for its impact on the mind rather than the body. The guardians had realized that fear administered intelligently produced compliance far more effectively than mere physical pain. The temple itself became a machine, a methodical system, for reinforcing obedience, and the traitors were its unwitting participants. Accounts, fragmented and often contradictory, describe an event where a small group of traitors was isolated in a side chamber designed to amplify sound. The guardians manipulated the space to create echoes of footsteps, whispers, and even faint chanting, so that the accused could not discern reality from illusion. A trembling movement in one corner could provoke a response that seemed to come from every wall, simultaneously. In this environment, perception became the weapon, and the mind of the traitor the battlefield. Over the course of hours, some broke, others feigned compliance, and a few remained motionless, their endurance testing the limits of human psychology. It was a terrifying, precise dance of control. The culmination of that night was a demonstration of power that reinforced the guardian's dominion over life and faith alike. The surviving traitors, those who endured the procedures, without collapse, were forever marked. Their memories of the night were fragmented, replaced by enforced rituals and vows of silence. The experience was designed to imprint on the psyche a lesson. Survival depended not on piety alone, but on absolute alignment with the guardian's will. Any hint of defiance, even an unintentional thought, could provoke consequences far beyond the capacity of ordinary imagination. That night also set a precedent. From that moment onward, every accusation, every test, and every punishment would be shadowed by the knowledge that the guardians were capable of actions that defied conventional morality and ritual law. The sacred traitors learned that devotion alone was insufficient. One had to anticipate the expectations of the guardians themselves, interpreting their subtle signals with an instinct sharpened to terror. And through this, the temple's control became absolute, its influence extending beyond the visible rituals into the very minds of its followers. The ceremony of the three lights was a ritual so secretive and intense that even the most seasoned elders approached it with caution. It was not recorded in the official temple annals, and only fragments of its description survive in obscure scrolls hidden deep within the sanctum. According to these fragments, the ceremony involved the traitors standing in the center of a triangular chamber illuminated by three distinct flames. each representing a principle of divine law, obedience, purity, and judgment. The lights were not mere torches. They were infused with substances that created unnatural flickers, casting shadows that seemed to move independently, as though the walls themselves had come alive to observe. The ritual began at the stroke of midnight, when the temple was silent except for the faint echo of whispered prayers from the guardians who observed from hidden alcoves. Each traitor was positioned at a point within the triangle, facing a flame that symbolized the aspect of the law they had allegedly violated. The guardians would chant in tonal sequences designed to resonate with the natural frequencies of the chamber, creating vibrations that unsettled the equilibrium of the accused. The traitors, cut off from all external reference points, experienced a disorienting sense of weightlessness and temporal distortion, as if hours could pass in a single breath. Every subtle twitch of a muscle, every hesitation was meticulously recorded by the listeners, ensuring that the slightest sign of defiance was noted and later acted upon. The three lights were not just symbolic. They were instruments of conditioning. One flame emitted a gentle heat, designed to induce introspection and a heightened awareness of moral obligation. Another flickered with sudden intensity, triggering spikes of adrenaline and forcing the traitors to confront fear in its rawest form. The third emitted a steady, almost imperceptible hum that interacted with the chamber's resonant frequencies, creating a disorienting psychological pressure that tested endurance beyond physical limits. The interplay of these flames was precise. Their purpose was to strip away individuality, leaving only compliance and obedience in their wake. During the ceremony, the guardians moved silently among the traitors, making minimal physical contact, an adjustment of the flame here, a gesture there, but their presence was suffocating. It was as if the air itself was watching. Some traitors reportedly entered a state of near hallucination, perceiving specters of past traitors appearing in the shadows, their faces distorted by candlelight and fear. The elders believed that by invoking these visions, the spirits of the temple's history would remind the traitors of the consequences of disobedience, reinforcing both guilt and compliance simultaneously. The ritual was cumulative. Repetition over nights created a psychological framework that bound the traitor's sense of self to the temple's definitions of loyalty. Those who emerged unbroken were considered exceptionally resilient, capable of surviving future scrutiny, while those who faltered were never seen in the public chambers again. Whispers suggest they were either retrained under harsher conditions or disappeared entirely, becoming part of the temple's unspoken archives, existences erased to maintain the sacred mythos. What made the ceremony of the three lights especially chilling was its dual purpose. It was both a test and a form of indoctrination. It confirmed the guardian's authority and simultaneously reshaped the consciousness of the traitors, ensuring that their perception of divine law was inseparable from the guardian's will. Over time, the ceremony became legendary, a dark rite that instilled obedience not through punishment alone, but through an intricate interplay of fear, perception, and ritualized awe. Those who understood the ritual's power knew that even the slightest lapse could seal a fate far worse than death itself. The fate of the sacred traitors reached its darkest point in the chamber known only to the highest-ranking guardians. This place, hidden beneath layers of stone and secrecy, was where the punishments of legend were enacted. Chambers so secret that even the most senior elders rarely witnessed them. It was here that the full weight of the guardian's authority became apparent, a chilling reminder that disobedience within the temple was not merely a breach of ritual, but a threat to the very structure of their sacred world. The traitors, isolated and bound, confronted not only their own fear, but the deliberate design of the guardians to test endurance, loyalty, and the limits of human will. The chamber was designed with psychological precision. Its walls were covered in bas reliefs depicting ancient victories and divine retribution, their images magnified by the flickering torchlight. Every shadow seemed to move independently, creating the illusion that the figures carved in stone were alive and watching. The air was heavy, saturated with incense, blended with substances meant to evoke unease and heighten sensory perception. The traitors could hear faint whispers, not from the guardians, but seemingly from the walls themselves, echoing past failures and imagined judgments. It was an environment engineered to amplify guilt, doubt, and terror simultaneously, leaving no room for resistance or rational thought. During this ritualized punishment, the guardians exercised complete control over perception and expectation. Sounds were manipulated, torches flickered at precise intervals, and the accused were guided through a sequence of movements designed to confuse and destabilize them. Even the act of standing or kneeling carried consequences. A single misstep, a trembling hand, or a faltered breath could be interpreted as defiance. The guardians documented these reactions meticulously, treating them as data for future assessments. No physical harm was strictly necessary. The manipulation of mind and perception alone was sufficient to enforce obedience. Some traitors reportedly endured these rituals without outward signs of faltering, their silence mistaken for strength. Others broke entirely, confessing to imagined misdeeds or offering exaggerated apologies for minor lapses. Regardless of their response, the guardian's purpose was achieved. The traitor's identity, once independent, became inseparable from the Temple's authority. Survival itself required absolute alignment with the will of Baal, as interpreted by those in control. In this way, the punishment was both method and indoctrination, binding the mind to the temple as effectively as chains could bind the body. The legacy of these chambers extended beyond the immediate victims. Their influence permeated the entire priesthood, creating a climate where fear and compliance were intertwined with devotion. Whispers among novices and mid-ranking, priests described figures who had entered the chambers and returned fundamentally changed, haunted by their experiences yet compelled to maintain the temple's order. Even those who were never summoned understood, instinctively, the power of the guardian's reach. The threat of entering these hidden rooms was sufficient to control entire generations of clergy. If any part of this story resonates with you, or if the idea of rituals that could manipulate mind and spirit fascinates you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insight may uncover perspectives that even the ancient witnesses could not articulate, and your reflections help keep these hidden histories alive for those seeking to understand the deepest shadows of human devotion. The Guardians' influence did not end with the traitors themselves. Their actions left enduring marks on the entire priesthood, a legacy of control and subtle cruelty that persisted long after the ceremonies were complete. Those who observed the punishments, who heard the whispers of the chambers and felt the oppressive presence of the three lights, became vessels of the Guardians' authority. Their loyalty was reinforced not only by fear, but by the knowledge that the temple itself demanded vigilance, an unbroken chain of obedience that extended to every corner of the sacred complex. The psychological architecture of power was as important as the stone walls that enclosed them, as vital as the sacred altars upon which their rituals were performed. Every acolyte, novice, and priest who entered the temple's inner sanctums was shaped by what they witnessed, even indirectly. Lessons were encoded in silence, in the strategic placement of torches and shadows, in the manipulation of sound and light, during rites that no outsider could comprehend. Trainees learned to anticipate the expectations of the guardians before a command was spoken, to read the unspoken signals of authority as acutely as if they were inscribed in the temple's stone. The effect was profound. A network of priests trained to enforce the temple's will, not through explicit orders, but through subtle coercion and psychological alignment, ensuring that the sacred order was maintained even in the absence of the guardians themselves. Over generations, this approach became institutionalized. Texts that survived the ravages of time, fragments preserved in hidden alcoves, copied by hand on brittle papyrus, hint at a system in which mentorship was inseparable from surveillance. Senior priests instructed novices in ritual practices while simultaneously testing their reactions, gauging their capacity for obedience, endurance, and perceptiveness. Success was measured not by knowledge of sacred law alone, but by the ability to navigate a complex web of expectations that were never fully articulated. Failure, or even hesitation, carried consequences that were never formally documented, maintaining the aura of unpredictability that strengthened the guardian's authority. The long-term psychological impact on the clergy was significant. Many priests carried the memory of witnessing punishment or hearing whispered accounts of the chambers, embedding a deep sense of vigilance and fear within the temple hierarchy. Even in ceremonies unrelated to discipline, subtle behaviors, adjustments in posture, tone of voice, or timing of responses were reinforced by the memory of past scrutiny. These learned behaviors created a culture of self-regulation, where obedience was not merely demanded but internalized. The temple had effectively created a system in which every priest became both subject and enforcer, perpetuating the cycle of control and secrecy without explicit oversight. The marks of the guardian's influence extended beyond individual behavior. Architectural design, spatial arrangement, and ritual timing were all infused with a psychological logic aimed at reinforcing hierarchy and submission. The hidden chambers, echoing corridors, and strategic lighting ensured that even the most seemingly mundane tasks carried subtle lessons in obedience. Over time, the clergy's collective consciousness adapted to this environment, internalizing fear as a guiding principle. The temple's legacy of cruelty was no longer dependent solely on the actions of individual guardians. It became an omnipresent, self-sustaining force that influenced every decision, every ritual, and every interaction within the sacred walls. And, yet, beneath this structure of fear and control, faint traces of doubt persisted. Hints that even the most disciplined acolytes were aware of the cost of the guardian's absolute power. These traces, however subtle, would one day influence how the secrets of the Temple of Baal were remembered, or deliberately obscured, from the eyes of the outside world. The manuscripts that survived the temple's relentless secrecy offer only fragments of a broader truth, leaving modern historians to reconstruct what might have been. These texts, often sealed in clay containers and hidden in alcoves far beneath the main chambers, reveal a selective record of the temple's practices and the punishments reserved for the sacred traitors. Many scrolls were intentionally fragmented or encrypted, ensuring that only those with sufficient authority and knowledge could interpret their meaning. Even the most careful translation yields ambiguity, hinting at atrocities so deliberate and calculated that the boundaries between ritual, law, and psychological control blur into indistinction. Within these manuscripts, references appear to tools and devices whose purpose is as much symbolic as functional. Implements used in punishment were often described with detailed care, Yet the accounts are so scattered that modern scholars debate whether they were ceremonial props, instruments of fear, or physical mechanisms of torment. Some passages suggest that every object within the temple could serve a dual purpose to facilitate sacred rituals while simultaneously reminding the traitors of the guardian's omnipresent oversight. The text emphasizes precision, repetition, and the maintenance of secrecy, portraying a culture in which every detail, no matter how minor, reinforced the hierarchy and the consequences of defiance. One particularly chilling set of fragments describes an audit of the temple's internal records, conducted by the guardians themselves. Names of accused traitors, their offenses, and the punishments meted out were meticulously logged, not for posterity, but for ongoing assessment. Every reaction, every sign of resilience or hesitation was evaluated and stored in a coded form. The manuscripts convey a system of perpetual surveillance and psychological conditioning, suggesting that the temple's power was sustained as much through record-keeping and memory as through the visible rituals of punishment. Even those who had endured the chamber's horrors were not exempt. Their actions were constantly monitored, their compliance continuously verified. The surviving texts also hint at deliberate obfuscation. Portions of the manuscripts were erased or overwritten, leaving gaps in the historical record that may have concealed practices deemed too extreme even by the guardians themselves. These erasures suggest a calculated manipulation of memory and narrative, ensuring that future generations would only glimpse fragments of the temple's full methods. In this way, the guardians exercised control not only over the living but over the historical memory of their actions, shaping how the temple's history would be interpreted long after their deaths. These hidden manuscripts also underscore the ambiguity of guilt within the temple. The concept of a sacred traitor was fluid, defined as much by perception and interpretation as by any tangible transgression. The surviving accounts demonstrate that accusations often relied on subtle observations, hesitation during a chant, a slight deviation from ritual posture, or even perceived doubt in thought or expression. The guardians used this ambiguity to reinforce their authority, maintaining an environment in which loyalty was not simply expected, it was continuously proven under conditions designed to test both mind and spirit. Ultimately, the fragments of these manuscripts reveal a temple where power was inseparable from secrecy, punishment, and psychological mastery. While much has been lost to time, the surviving records illuminate a complex system in which the guardians wielded authority through an intricate web of observation, ritual, and hidden chambers. These documents offer glimpses of a culture in which obedience was both demanded and ingrained, where the line between spiritual guidance and coercion was deliberately erased, and where the memory of the sacred traitors was preserved only in coded text and shadowed corridors, waiting for those who dared to piece the story together. The revelation of the temple's deepest secrets does not come gently. As the chronicles of the sacred traitors unfold, one cannot help but confront the full scope of the guardian's control, the methods, the chambers, the psychological mastery designed to bend faith and obedience into an unbroken chain. The final chapter of this hidden history reveals not only the fate of the traitors themselves, but the enduring consequences of the guardian's power on every priest who served within those stone walls. The temple's rituals, once thought to preserve divine order, instead became a mechanism of subtle terror, ensuring that devotion was inseparable from submission. Every priest carried the memory of the three lights, the chamber of echoes, and the silent punishments, embedding fear into the very fabric of the sacred hierarchy. Those who survived the ceremonies, who endured observation and psychological scrutiny, emerged not as free agents, but as extensions of the guardian's will. Their loyalty was no longer a matter of choice. It had been forged through fear, ritual, and the constant awareness that a misstep, a hesitation, or a moment of doubt could result in consequences far beyond imagination. The sacred traitors' suffering, their endurance, and their disappearance were not merely historical footnotes. They were the foundation upon which the temple's power rested. And while the corridors of the temple remained hidden from the outside world, the psychological architecture created by the guardians extended far beyond the stone walls, influencing behavior, obedience, and belief in ways that cannot be measured or fully understood. Yet even in the darkness, faint traces of rebellion remained. Whispers of courage, fragments of memory, and subtle acts of defiance persisted among those who had witnessed the rituals but survived. These traces suggest that the human spirit, though tested and constrained, was never entirely broken. The temple's legacy is a paradox: absolute control, coexisting with the resilience of those who endured, creating a shadowed history that challenges our understanding of devotion, authority, and morality. It is a reminder that power, even when cloaked in divine purpose, carries consequences that extend far beyond its intended reach. If you have followed this journey into the hidden chambers, the secret rituals, and the fate of the sacred traitors, take a moment to reflect on what these stories reveal. Consider leaving a comment with your thoughts or insights, perhaps a phrase like, "This message was for me," or "I see now the depths of their control," to show that you have journeyed to the heart of the temple with us. If you found this exploration compelling, hit the like button and check if you are subscribed so you don't miss future journeys into forgotten and forbidden histories. And remember, there is more to uncover. Other hidden chapters await in the shadows, waiting to challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient civilizations and the limits of human devotion. The story of the guardians and the sacred traitors may end here, but the echoes of their control, the strategies of fear, and the lessons of resilience continue to resonate, leaving us with questions about power, faith, and the human capacity to endure even the most calculated cruelty. This is the final glimpse into the temple's hidden chambers. But the deeper truths are never truly gone. They are waiting for those willing to see, understand, and remember.